So, welcome to everyone here, and thank you to Diara and Chris, who did a great job of organising us and getting everything ready for today. I can tell you we've got some fantastic panellists. We've spent some time over the last week or so preparing what we're going to discuss over this panel, and I can tell you there are some great minds and great perspectives that you're going to hear from. As a fellow Workspace customer, I can tell you that these kind of events are fantastic for networking within the Workspace ecosystem. We've already picked up business from some of our co-tenants in CargoWorks, and long may that continue for all of us, I say. So a little on Filament. Filament, we've been running about 2 years with 25 AI and machine learning experts. We've been working with organizations like HSBC and Deutsche Telekom and Amex and a number of other enterprises you would know and some that you wouldn't. And our players all are about applied artificial intelligence, so actually making it meaningful and worthwhile and valuable in business today. I'm going to let the guys introduce themselves in a moment, but this panel is going to be about the trends and the momentum that AI is now getting. As Diara mentioned, I was working in IBM Watson from 2011 when Watson beat the Jeopardy champions, you may recall. And over that period of time, I've seen AI as an industry grow from really being early adopters and early sort of experimentation through to a position we are today where we are, I would say, on the verge of crossing the chasm, to borrow someone else's phrase. It's really looking at developing into mass adoption. So, without further ado, I will let Matt and Ben introduce themselves. This panel is going to be, as I said, about the mega trends in the industry, how we're seeing the change in the workplace, and we're going to touch on some of the interesting ethical issues that AI brings to the table. So, Ben.
Cool. Yeah, my name is Ben Dellot. I work for an organisation called the RSA, stands for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, which is why we say the RSA. And I work in the research team there, and we look at a whole variety of different issues. Myself, I look at the future of work and the changing nature of technology, and in that Venn diagram there's this interesting overlap, which leads us to talk about the impact of automation on jobs. Shall I explain a little bit about our research, or shall I come back to that?
No, go for it now.
Yeah, okay, so last year we published a report looking at the impact of AI and robotics specifically on jobs, and in particular low-skilled workers. And we came at this debate, not new to it, but relatively fresh-minded and open-minded as well. And we were just trying to figure out, do the headlines, which predict the mass automation of jobs and economic strife as a result of these technologies, do they actually live up to reality? Are they likely to actually bear reality? So we did some research, we did some surveying, we did some interviews with employers, and we published our report. And I guess there are just three big takeaways that I want to touch on very quickly. Number one is that our perspective is that there is a lot of hype out there, and there are several reasons why the technology is unlikely to lead to huge job losses, at least in the near future. One of those is that we're talking about technology that automates tasks, not just jobs. So if you think about retail, if you were to walk up Oxford Street in the next 5 years and you see a lot of self-service checkouts, you think, okay, surely that leads to a lot of lost jobs. In reality, that particular task, and that it is a task of being a cashier, is only one among many in a basket that retail workers do, and it's the same across the whole economy. So we're talking about the automation of tasks, not jobs, and people can pivot into new roles. Secondly, technology complements, not just competes. So one of the interesting organizations that we came across was a a domiciliary care service in East London called Three Sisters Care. They're working with Bristol Robotics Laboratory, trying to design a robotic system which can be installed in the homes of patients to help care workers who only have like 15 or 20 minutes with patients to lift and carry them, to do some of the more manual work, the heavy lifting, which deprives them of the time to actually do what they're meant to be doing, which is caring and being attentive and putting people at ease. And a big third reason is that the technology and automation itself has some interesting, subtle effects on demand in our economy. So we've come up with this term called recycle demand, which is a concept which tries to describe how automation may lead to an increase in productivity, which reduces the price of certain goods, and that money is then spent in another part of the economy. So to make that a bit more real for you, there was a study done in the States not long ago looking at the impact of legal software on the legal industry. And there's a lot of discussion now about the impact of AI on the legal industry and the assumption that a lot of jobs will be lost, particularly among junior clerks. And the study that they found was that actually there wasn't a big impact on job numbers, partly because the software was reducing the price of legal services, which meant that more people were buying them. Now that works for the elastic demand, but it's a phenomenon that we spot. Second big trend, very quickly, is that the second big finding is that we have to talk about automation in terms of timescale. So whenever you pick up a newspaper and it says 30% of jobs to be lost by automation, it doesn't say when. And it's really important that we talk about, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, we need to be quite clear of that. So to give you another example, if you look at the changing job numbers across retail and warehouse work, over the last few years, there's been quite a large reduction in the number of workers in bricks and mortar retail shops, partly a result of e-commerce, but big rise in the number of warehouse jobs. So people are shopping online, and that means that you have a lot more Amazon warehouses, a lot more IKEA warehouses, a lot more DPD warehouses, and so on. And so if you looked at that on the surface, you say, okay, well, it doesn't matter because this technology is creating jobs elsewhere, but that's the next 5 years. Next 15, 20 years, you'll have a lot more automation in those warehouses. And this is important because if you're an educator, if you're a government official working in the Department for Education, you need to know where you should be trying to upskill people, in what sectors and in what occupations. And a third final point I'll just touch on very briefly, and this was the main finding and the main, takeaway of our report is that actually the UK, the problem is not that we're adopting this technology too quickly, it's that we're adopting it too slowly. So with the poll that we did of employers in the private sector, with YouGov, we found that only 14% of businesses were actively investing in AI or robotics. Big chunks say it's too costly, big chunks say it's not proven, and an even larger chunk just don't seem to be aware of it at all. And unsurprisingly, it's the small businesses that are particularly unaware of it. And you might say, okay, that's fine. Isn't that great? We can just go back to business as usual and stick with the status quo. But it's worth thinking about what the status quo actually is. So the status quo is flatline of productivity in the UK, real wages that are the slowest growing at the slowest rate in 100 odd years. And if we continue at that level, then we're likely to see stagnant living standards and even declining living standards because of the demands of an aging population. So actually, we need to automate, but to do it on our own terms is the way that we phrase it. I can talk about what we mean by that, but I think I've sort of given a...
So I'd like to bring in Matt at this point, because you work for a think tank that comes from a slightly different perspective, but I'm sure you could build on some of Ben's comments there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm Matt Fenech. I'm an AI research and advocacy coordinator for an independent think tank called Future Advocacy. So we do work in terms of policy development and advocacy in a number of fields, including childhood obesity, HIV/AIDS, but I lead the work on artificial intelligence. And our sort of tagline for this project is maximizing the opportunities and minimizing the risks of AI. So we're not doom-mongers, we're optimistic about the technologies and agree with a lot of what Ben just said. But clearly there are risks, there are things we need to be thinking about, and what we would like to do is occupy that space between research and, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And being very political facing and government facing. And our work on AI is subdivided into 4 main sub-projects. So the one I guess we'll be talking about most is around the future of work. I'll just quickly briefly mention the other work I'm doing. My own background is in healthcare, and I'm doing a project at the moment, which maybe we'll get to discuss, around the impact of AI in healthcare, where, again, it's a potentially very disruptable field by AI. Also did some work for Sir Tim Berners-Lee's Web Foundation on the impact of AI in low and middle income countries. And what was very interesting there is that there are a lot of the trends which are very similar to advanced economies, Western economies, but there are some very interesting specific problems that developing countries may need to face. And also a general project on data and data ethics, the impact of GDPR and other things. With respect to the Future of Work project, our last sort of big piece of research was released last October. And what we did there was to look in the UK at the impact of automation across the geography of the UK. And we adopted a very parliamentary constituency approach. And obviously we did that in order to be able to start a political debate, start a political discussion by being able to go to each one of the 632 great British MPs, because we didn't have data for Northern Ireland, so the 632 MPs, and say, this is the risk of automation in your particular constituency. What are we going to do about it? And what was really interesting about that was that there's a real spread, essentially. So we based our work on what was then the cutting-edge analysis of the automatability of different sectors, which was done by PwC. And as Ben said, the headline figure there is 30% of UK jobs are at risk of automation by the early 2030s. But as we just heard, you know, there's a lot of vagueness on what that actually means. But what we found is when you look at each parliamentary constituency, and then when you look at groups of constituencies in different regions, the figure actually varies from 20 to 40%. So the highest risk constituency, through a gift of the PR gods, was Shadow Chancellor John MacDonald's constituency, which is that of Hayes and Harlington. And why is that? That's because there's Heathrow there. Mm-hmm. And that's because transport and logistics are, of course, mooted as being a very automatable sector. That's the highest risk constituency, but looking at regions, the Midlands and the north of England appear to be most at risk. And obviously the implication there is these are areas that have already gone through phases of deindustrialization. You know, we can speak at length about the politics. There are, for example, areas that voted heavily to leave the European Union. There are very many potential reasons for that. So whatever happens, I mean, just an interesting stat which I always quote when asked. So one area at high risk is the constituency of North Warwickshire. And Warwickshire had a thriving mining industry. And it's estimated that about 19,000 mining jobs were lost in the 100 years between 1913 and 2013 in the whole of Warwickshire. By our analysis, we found that around 20,000 jobs currently in North Warwickshire could be lost over the next 15 years. Now, that's the same amount, but between 100 to 15 years. So the scale and the speed is of a different order of magnitude. Now, obviously, you know, the numbers have margins of errors, and we don't really want to, I don't think our aim was to say this is the exact amount of jobs that are going to be lost in this very granular area. But really to start the debate, and what we found most helpful was to be able to go to politicians, to policymakers, to businesses, and say, okay, these technologies are going to create many new jobs, many of which we can't even predict now. Who would have predicted, you know, 5-10 years ago that social media manager was going to be a job, you know, some years ago. So there's going to be new jobs created, but what if these jobs are all created in the south, in the southeast, and people in the north and Midlands are losing the jobs? How does that help the people in those areas? So really what we want to get across is we really need to understand more about who's going to be most affected in terms of their skill mix, in terms of the sector they're working on. There are differential impacts on gender as well, in order to be able to target our interventions there. And yeah, I can talk more about these potential interventions as well.
Yeah, very interesting. So, I mean, netting that out, you can see there's generally positive impacts of automation and the introduction of AI, but we need to put these systemic enablers in place to enable the re-education of our workforce to maximize the positive and minimize the risks. So I'm just going to change tack a touch because I know that you've both been exploring the impact of AI on the political system and democracy and you know, the hyper-personalized marketing that AI can enable. So, Ben, can you talk a little bit about the work you've done with DeepMind in exploring that?
Yeah, so we have just launched a new project with DeepMind to try to explore the ethical implications of AI. So less about what AI will do in the workplace and more about what it will do to households overall. So what it means for privacy, for discrimination, for authentic human relationships. And the reason why we did this is because we felt that there was an emerging public conversation, but not deep and not sophisticated. And so one of the things that we're doing with DeepMind is running a series of citizen juries to try to understand what the public think is an acceptable use of AI. And the reason why we're doing it is because we really do think there are true dilemmas in the use of this technology, in the sense that there are real trade-offs. So if you take the example of the use of AI in marketing, in marketing, people have always tried to shape other people's behavior and consumers' behavior, getting them to buy things. So when does it become a problem to use AI which knows a bit more about what will push someone's buttons to get them to buy things? The same with political processes. Political parties have always tried to use focus groups and surveys to try to understand what is it that people care about and what is it that will get them to vote for them, to the point where they know in a particular ward that a group of people will care about the NHS or will care about a local school closing down, and then they'll put an advert up which presents their view on that and their take on that. So again, when does it become problematic to use AI to do individualized profiling? And so there's also an interesting conversation around social care, which we were just talking about before we kicked off. This is a bit further into the future, the idea that potentially you could use robotics to improve social care, to help really plug some of the gaps in that area. And for some people, this is a really awful idea, because caring is meant to have sanctity attached to it. It's meant to be only delivered by humans, and the idea of farming out to machines is just something that's abhorrent. They couldn't even possibly imagine it. But again, you have to bear in mind that we have 300,000 odd vacancies at any one point in social care. And so it's meant to be plugging gaps. So the whole point of this public jury exercise is really to find out what do the public find to be a good use and a bad use, so that we can not settle for good these dilemmas, because that's going to be impossible, but just to raise it to the surface and have a bit more of a sophisticated conversation, so that it's not just an academic one.
Absolutely. And so building on that, Matt, talking about healthcare, which I know is your specialist industry, just tell us a few of the use cases and the ethical dilemmas that are associated with AI in healthcare.
Sure. So where to begin? I think we can probably divide the use cases in probably about 4 different categories. So there's a lot about the back-end business of healthcare, the logistics, the appointment booking, scheduling, and all of that. So that's probably seen as being less ethically difficult, but actually not one where there's great leaps and bounds being made at the moment. There's in research, in healthcare research, and what I'm thinking here is genomics, is drug discovery. So a lot of biomedical research nowadays is about the creation of vast data sets. We've had, now 20 odd years of just churning out huge amounts of data because we can, and now we're sitting back and thinking, all right, well, we better start to parse through and understand this data, and this is where data analytics and AI can help. So we know already that companies like Benevolent AI and others are using AI machine learning to screen huge libraries of compounds to be able to detect the most likely drug targets or potential drugs to be able to take forward, because of course taking a drug to market is such an expensive process, so anything that speeds it up is a good thing. Then there's the clinical applications, and in this what's really, and by clinical I mean sort of the clinical workflow, so the process by which a patient presents to their doctor, gets a diagnosis, gets treatment. And in this, what is really coming on in leaps and bounds is anything that involves image analysis. And that's really a function of where we are with technology. It's machine vision which has really come forward in the last few years. So in terms of applications, we're looking at radiology, so scans, x-rays being analyzed by image analytics. Again, is this going to replace doctors, radiologists, radiographers? The answer is probably not, for two reasons. Firstly, as much as a radiologist would definitely tell you they're not just a fracture detection machine. They're not just going to look at an x-ray and say, yes, your ankle is broken, or no, your ankle is not broken. This is speaking to the point of task that Ben made. A person, a professional, does a number of different things, and one hugely repetitive, automatable thing. It might be good if a machine did that, and maybe you plugged it in at the beginning of the workflow. So at the beginning of the day, they come in, and their AI tells them, well, the first scans you should look at are these 10 because these are the ones which we think are most abnormal. So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, the shortage of healthcare workers. So radiologists, for example, there's a shortage in the UK, a shortage foreseen for the foreseeable future. So this type of application may be important. And the last use case is in the delivery of treatment, and maybe this is where, again, some of the ethical implications come up. So there are attempts to deliver psychotherapy and talking therapies via chatbot. I visited Alder Hey Hospital up in Liverpool, which has developed and rolled out within the NHS a bot to help patients, and this is a pediatric hospital, so it's children and their parents, to learn more about their hospital stay and ask questions, everything from what does a blood test feel like to where are the nearest toilets, the things that people would not think of asking, basically. And it's these more patient-facing interactions that are very interesting. The truth is, just as Ben was saying with automation, it's not happening enough, probably. There's just so much fear, because one of the ethical points is about the use of patient data. There's already so much about the use of data in business contexts, in insurance context. When you're talking about medical data, it adopts a whole new level of, it's personal, it's private. So data sharing within the NHS and other healthcare systems is a major barrier at the moment to more innovation in this space. Other ethical issues that we're thinking about are taking humans out of the loop completely. Would you want to have your diagnosis given to you by a smartphone, you alone, or would you rather have somebody to talk to if you're being told that, I don't know, the funny-looking mole looks a bit suspicious on your skin? And again, this is not science fiction. There's a team in Stanford that's developing a smartphone app where you just take photos of your moles, and it tells you this is likely to be cancer, this is not likely to be cancer. So, so much going on at the moment, and the thing to remember with healthcare is it comes out as an industry which is not very automatable on the PwC reports and all these other reports. But again, we just need to keep remembering that it's tasks that are automated, and there's so much in healthcare and in other service industries that is repetitive, automatable, and that's where the applications are going to be.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to go to the floor for questions in just one moment, so get your questions ready. Before we do, there's one last topic, Ben, I want you to take on. So the legal system of, let's say 10 years' time, where we've had to pre-program certain ethical judgments into self-learning systems. How is it going to feel, and how do you think this is going to play out?
So the use of algorithms in criminal courts. We were talking about this before, and this comes back to a bigger ethical issue around explainability. So in some criminal courts, in particular in the States, algorithms are now used to inform bail decisions. So data is collected on a defendant, a whole load of variables are crunched, and the judge is informed through this algorithm the likelihood that someone will skip their bail and whether they therefore should be granted it. And in Florida, there was an investigation by a media company called ProPublica, and they found that the algorithm used in this Florida court was twice as likely to falsely flag black defendants as future criminals as non-black defendants. So the algorithm was, provably discriminatory and shouldn't be used. Now, I think that's where it's easy for us to say that it shouldn't be used. Where it becomes much more difficult is where the algorithm say in the next few years, becomes quite accurate. And that's where it becomes tricky. So if an algorithm is 99% accurate at predicting whether someone is going to skip their bail, and a judge is 90%, do we want to go with the algorithm? Or do we have higher standards for machines than we do for humans? Do we want 100% from them? And we're happy to have 90% from humans. On paper, you'd say no, but like actually in practice, humans are a bit strange in the way that they think. So yeah, it's a very tricky one. And then the other thing here is, in terms of explainability, so the use of machine learning algorithms and the difficulty of being able to parse out and understand why they arrived at a certain decision, why person X was granted bail and person Y was not. That's the black box nature of that. A lot of people have problems with. But I think, Matt, you made a really good point before, which is that one of the most common black boxes we have at the moment is the human mind. So judges may be able to verbally explain why they came to a certain conclusion, but how can we believe them? How can we believe that they arrived at a certain decision that wasn't biased? So I think there's a whole load of, it's complicated is a bit of an easy answer, but it is.
Yeah.
I'll just chip in quickly on this. So the compass algorithm that Ben was just talking about is an example of how not to do this. So when challenged by ProPublica, the manufacturer said, sorry, this is proprietary, we're not going to tell you what's going on in this black box. And clearly, this is not allowable. You could argue whether it's allowable in general in public sector, but certainly in this case, when it was proven to be doing the wrong thing, it wasn't allowable. Recently came across a really good example of similar algorithms, which is in New Zealand. I spoke to an academic yesterday who's based in New Zealand, who's developing predictive analytic tools to deploy in social services to identify families where the children are most at risk of child abuse. Now you would think this is, nobody would even go there. It's such a, scary topic. But, and of course, the big thing in New Zealand is that it's Maori communities which are at the greatest risk and are marginalized. But what they did, and I think this is a really good example of how to go about doing things, is before deploying the algorithms, they went out, they did community outreach projects. They asked the communities, what do you want from this? What was acceptable? And it's about the red lines that you were talking about how far can these algorithms go? And what they found, for example, was that that people expected everybody to be discriminatory because these communities are so used to being discriminated against. But when they were involved in the process and they found that these algorithms could actually be helpful in flagging up potential problems to an overstretched social services, they were very accepting. So there's good examples out there as well as bad examples, really.
Right, very interesting. So have we got any questions? Yes, one over there.
So my question is about, as the owner of let's say, an autonomous vehicle which has AI driving, should I be able to set the ethics of my car to suit my demands? So I'll use the example, there's a car crash going to happen. I can either drive into a brick wall with almost certain death, or I can drive over a pedestrian. Now, as a human being, you will make that snap decision. But should I be allowed to change the ethics of my vehicle that I bought?
No. Because the consequences of your decisions have ramifications for everyone, right? And so it seems unlikely that you'll ever be able to come up with a system or a particular task or activity which only has consequences for you and not for other people. So, yeah, I'm unsure.
The state should set my ethics?
Not necessarily, but we do elect governments to represent us. That's representative democracy.
And we have laws which represent sort of society's acceptance of what's acceptable or not.
Yeah. But it raises a good point because, just to elaborate on that, the status quo in the situation right now might be that actually you have private companies which set your ethics, set everyone's ethics, and what's permissible and what's not permissible. And that shouldn't necessarily be the case. It should be a broader social conversation. But how we get it from me just saying a broader social conversation, which sounds seriously woolly, into something much more practical is difficult. But yeah, it can't just be you, but it also can't just be private companies. It has to be much bigger.
Very good question. Yep.
So this might be a crazy question at this time, but
How are you all defining artificial intelligence per se? Because you've used some examples which for me speak to computers, mathematics, algorithms, analysis, and many things which have been happening for decades already.
Yeah.
So where are you drawing the line on what is new versus what is old and just been brought together?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Should I take that? So there's the old joke about when something starts being used regularly, it ceases to be artificial intelligence, it becomes just a computer program, isn't it? So, I mean, the term was coined in the 1950s. This is not a new thing. I think I can say this as an enthusiastic amateur because I don't have a computer science background, but in my head, we've got sort of the older rule-based symbolic systems, what's called good old-fashioned AI, basically, which really, and of course there's been sort of AI winters and AI springs and hype cycles in AI for many years now, but it's these sort of older rule-based symbolic systems where programs were explicitly programmed along very complicated decision trees, and what I have in mind is more like Deep Blue and chess and winning against Garry Kasparov. And the newer techniques, which are the more statistical techniques, which are based on machine learning, or rather machine learning is one that has come to the fore, of which a subset would be neural networks and deep learning. To me, there's a very blurry line between artificial intelligence, machine learning is a subset of that, predictive analytics, data analytics. I mean, any algorithm which can learn how to solve a problem and optimize this problem solving could be seen to be sort of artificial intelligence. But again, I say this without a computer science background. So.
Yeah. So I totally echo that. And I think when people talk about AI today, they basically mean machine learning onwards, so not expert systems. But what I find quite interesting is how our concepts, understanding, and notions of intelligence are malleable and change. So artificial intelligence normatively would be any machine which can replicate a human tasks that we would consider to be intelligent or require human intelligence. And you could say that, say, search engines were a form of AI in the sense that they are retrieving information, and that was previously a task that would be reserved for humans, say, in libraries. But because we use a search engine on a day-to-day basis, we no longer think of any of them as special. And so we wouldn't class them as AI. And so I think the definition is certainly malleable and subject to flux, but I think when we talk about it and the way that it's got a lot of traction and attention recently, it's really, as Matt says, it's more about the machine learning onwards. Yeah, because you could say like an ATM is expert.
setting effects is also taking out a function of having to manually copy something with ink and post it.
Yeah.
And it's automated.
Yeah,
So
that's
automation. I think it's machine learning ability to make decisions based on information you have. But AI seems to be all these things get bucketed into one.
yeah, completely, and it's very confusing. I mean, if you're talking about ethics and the ethical issues associated with AI, I mean, a lot of it does boil down to machine learning because it's about algorithms which sort of self-program, so to speak. And that then raises a whole lot of issues around explainability and interpretation, and you just didn't have that previously with old versions of AI.
It's a good question. Right, we've got another one at the back.
Hi. I am wondering, this is perhaps a personal question, but I am just jumping in there. I'm wondering what has personally blown your mind in what you do? Has anything, did you sort of have to pinch yourself? I'm thinking of the films that we mentioned in the introduction. Were they more reality than fiction? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Gee, thanks. I think I can't think of anything specific. I mean, at the moment, as I say, I'm focusing on applications of AI in healthcare, and the accuracy or potential accuracy of these applications is, you're approaching 99.9%, which is, superhuman, essentially. Actually, yeah, I think the thing which really did blow my mind was the AlphaGo story, the DeepMind AlphaGo story. So this is an algorithm that learned how to play one of the most complicated games in human history, much more complicated than chess. It learned without being explicitly programmed. The most recent version learned by playing against itself, I think within 4 hours or something like that. So that aspect of how far we've come blows my mind. But the important thing to remember is that AlphaGo 0 is never going to be able to make a cup of tea. So the important, I can't remember the exact quote, but the things which we see as not requiring intelligence are actually the hardest thing to replicate and the hardest thing to automate. And there's something very interesting there about the interface, the sort of computational neuroscience and the interface between what we see as all the various tasks that we do and replicating them in silico.
Yeah, I'd sort of turn it on its head slightly. And things that I find surprising is the headlines and the hype that surrounds this technology. So yeah, there are certain breakthroughs like AlphaGo 0 which really are truly impressive. But I think there's something really interesting about human fascination with machines and automation. So even if, to give you one brief anecdote, when we published our report last year, we wrote our press notice. The press notice was pretty positive. It was saying the problem is that the UK doesn't invest enough in this technology. And yes, there will be certain job losses, but as a whole, we're talking about wealth-creating technology, and we just need to figure out a way of distributing that wealth. The newspaper that took our press notice, and we gave an exclusive to, took one fact, I think, which is around job losses, and then turned it into a headline saying 4.8 million jobs are going to be lost as a result of this technology. And I found that
Usually with
fascinating.
the picture of the Terminator, isn't it?
Yeah, there's stuff like that, and so what I find fascinating is just our kind of attachment to this story and this narrative, which was introduced at the beginning around how these machines are the bad guys, and actually it's a political question about how we distribute the gains and the benefits that's a real interesting question.
Yeah. Cool. We haven't done this side of the room, so there you go.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the flip side and the human connections and loneliness and things like this, because you talked about it in medicine, and perhaps soon it won't be a doctor telling you breaking news about cancer and stuff like this. My grandmother used to go to the bank to cash her check, and that was taken away from her, and she didn't want that. That was the one source of communication with a human being. So we're going so far away from this, it feels. We have the End Loneliness Joe Cox campaign, and now even a commissioner of loneliness, I think. So I don't know, I'd just like to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think it's a very important point. It really touches on the issues to do around healthcare, around social care. I think there's competing trends here. So let's take the social care element. So Japan has in its government policy that by the mid-2020s, 80% of people who are receiving care are receiving some form of robot-assisted care. So that's their government policy. And that sounds impressive, but then you remember that, of course, Japan has this demographic time bomb, essentially, with certain villages where the average age is in the 70s, the average age of this village. So Ben mentioned the statistic for social care jobs which remain unfilled in the UK. So we have this trend where people are getting older, people are living longer, and the care needs are going to increase. We've gotten better in healthcare at treating the conditions that kill you at a very young age, like infection and trauma, having a car accident or falling off a ladder or something, but much worse at treating the conditions which you have in older life. So there's that trend. On the flip side, there is this sense of the sanctity of the human connection, isn't there? And as part of this project we're currently doing, we're speaking to patients, their representatives, their relatives, and it's you would expect that people would always want to speak to a human, but there was a study released by the Open Data Institute recently, which said that people are actually more happy to give their health data to the NHS than they are to give it to a close relative. So we have this very complicated relationship between our personal needs and technology. I think, and it was always the case. I mean, I agree with you. The whole discussion around social media at the moment, it wasn't that long ago when newspaper headlines were saying Facebook is going to save the world, Google is going to save the world. And now the front page of The Economist is saying, these are the worst companies at the moment. So there's been a sea change in social expectations of social media companies, of technology. And I think you're right. I think people are revisiting what we want from technology and trying to incorporate this human element. And there may be many ways of going around this, but I think one important way is to really involve service users, end users, the people who are going to be buying or using these technologies in their development. And I gave that example in New Zealand. DeepMind are a very good example. Their health branch does regular meetings and workshops with patients. We cannot have this top-down approach of either governments or the private sector or a combination of the two, developing the tool and then foisting it. We need to do it in a horizontal rather than a vertical.
Yeah. What's interesting is that there is an assumption that people will be much happier to interact with machines when it's quite transactional task. So comfortable, for example, using a chatbot to find out about what their bank balance is likely to be at the end of the month or how much their bill is likely to be, but far less comfortable going into a hospital and engaging with an AI interface, which is about diagnosis. And I think, broadly speaking, that's probably true, but as Matt alluded to there, for certain specific interactions, people would probably prefer to interact with a kind of anonymous machine. So around maybe therapy, around sharing their deepest concerns and worries. I was at an event last year and someone was talking about Samaritans and how their hunch was that actually people would prefer to talk about their deepest, darkest secrets with an anonymous machine, which would never remember it and divulge it in the future, rather than a human. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's one theory. But then coming back to a bigger point, I don't know if you guys have come across a writer called Evgeny Morozov, who he hates tech companies, and he's come up with a term called solutionism, which is coming up with solutions to problems that don't necessarily exist.
Yep.
And so tech companies invent them and then develop a solution to them. And you can find that throughout, our economy. And I think there's a danger that, we do that with AI and when we see it as a solution to both problems that exist and problems that don't exist right now. When some of these issues around care, for example, and the lack of care workers, there's a temptation to say, okay, you've got 300,000 social care vacancies, how can technology plug that gap? When actually you should be thinking, how do we get more people into those vacancies by changing the status of that job, by paying people more, by giving them more than 15 minutes with their patients.
Yep.
That's the hardest stuff to do, but arguably worthwhile, not just saying that technology is the answer to everything.
Who was that writer you mentioned?
Evgeny Morozov.
Just to add a small point, which is this is exactly about when we're talking about reskilling, re-education, these solutions to automation. It's these creative and interpersonal skills which are going to be resistant to automation for longer. And it's all well and good saying, let's focus, let's invest heavily in STEM, education, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But we already have algorithms that can code better than humans. So coding and programming is not going to be a resistant task for very, very long. So maybe, as Leslie is saying, we need to invest and value caring and interpersonal professions and tasks more, and hopefully that will be a good outcome, essentially, of all of this.
Yeah, great question.
Firstly, thank you for a very interesting discussion tonight. I was wondering if you had any sort of further resources or books or things that you found particularly inspiring on the topics that you've covered that you could share with us?
Yeah. There's a guy called Rodney Brooks, who is a robotics expert based in the States. And he looks at something I touched on before, which was why we're hooked on this idea that machines will automate jobs. And even if we're presented with contradictory evidence, we still come back to that analysis and that conclusion. And he looks at it as from a behavioral science point of view. And one of the things, so he's got an essay, which I'll try and find the link to, and I'll find you afterwards and send it to you. But he points out like 5 core like behavioral quirks of humans and why we sort of latch onto this idea of mass automation. And one of them is that we spot that machine can do task X, and then our minds extrapolate and think that they can do 100 other things. So if, for example, we find out that a machine can translate French to English, we then think that they can, or in the near future, will be able to speak very fluently as a chatbot and so on and so forth. And he kind of just tries to deconstruct that, those behavioral heuristics and quirks. It's really, really worth a read.
Books, yeah, I can't remember the author's name, but 2 sort of resources which have been really helpful in being kept up to date at the moment are email newsletters. There's the Exponential View by Azim Azhar, which some of you may be subscribed to, which I find very good. And there's Tech Emergence by Dan Faggella as well, which is very business focused, which may be more relevant to this audience. And those I found are really good resources. Because I'm a sci-fi geek at heart, I really enjoyed Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. And we were very lucky to host him last October, and he talked about this book. And it's, you know, it's nice every now and then to allow ourselves to just imagine what the possibilities are. And yeah, I found it a very, very fascinating and inspiring book.
Alongside Matt and my work too.
Yeah, exactly. Our website. Yeah.
And I'm going to give each of the guys a chance to do their final comments in a moment, but thank you very much for the questions and the interaction. We will be breaking for dinner next, and then we'll be coming back on a bit more of a practical session on how AI has been applied in different industries. So I'll give the final words to our esteemed guests. So Ben, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I guess I'll finish in the way that we finished our last report, which was just saying that the potential for job losses as a result of this technology should be seen in the context of 100 other issues which face us. So everything from managing an aging society to dealing with antimicrobial resistance and problems with drug discovery, and so on and so on. And so we have to view it in the context of all these other issues, but then also see AI as one potential solution which can help to alleviate them without falling into the trap of solutionism. So I'd finish on quite an optimistic note that this technology is a force for good. It's about, because the whole problem that we've had to deal with throughout humankind is around scarcity. Now we're finally having a problem of accumulation and abundance, and that's a pretty good problem to have. So it's turning into a political question of how we distribute those gains.
Yeah, equally, very optimistic about these technologies. I think the important thing to remember is the unequal impact, how more work is needed to really understand who's going to be most impacted. I think from the point of view of business and business audience, I think have those conversations about how automation, how these technologies can impact your work. Have them not only internally in your boardrooms, but have them with your customers, have them with your employees. There are many examples throughout history of when automation was or technology was foisted on a society, from the Luddites all the way through to the Uber in Paris and Airbnb in Berlin, where taxi drivers and hoteliers, respectively, were very unhappy with the sudden arrival of this technology. So have these conversations with your customers, your employees, and the more broad-based that conversation is, the more acceptable there'll be, and then we can really reap the benefits.
Excellent. Thank you very much, guys.